Everybody come out okay Monday through the hurricane? As it was interesting, it was 9/11. And, we even closed church early. Got to the house, and after I got off the roof in the middle of the storm, which somebody posted on Facebook, for me to take much ribbing about. I was looking, and for 2 weeks, we've been watching hurricanes. And literally this morning, I read about hurricanes and the responses. But then I picked up something, and by the way, I hate when I find something that's really good on Facebook, I'm like, oh my, is this real? How do you go prove something? And there was this article that was written in Romania in late September or early October of 2001. It's called Ode to America. I do not remember the author's name. I actually went and dug it all up. If you want to see it, I'll provide it for you. But think back about 9/11. Here's somebody from a communist country. I guess at that point it's no longer communist, but when I was there in 2000, it still had so much of that feel to it. They were looking across to America, and they were watching how we responded. Do you remember? Because it's very similar to what we were watching with Harvey and Irma and on and on. There were no red states. There were no blue states. There were no colors of skin. It was to raise the American flag. There were people who ran toward the danger and not from it. Nobody pointed at the president. Nobody said you didn't do this or you didn't do that. They went to help. We sent money, we sent water, we sent teams. And they were looking, and he said, we couldn't figure it out. He said they speak every language in the world in that country. He said, what made them be able to come together after those horrific events? No fighting, no rioting. He said it had to be freedom. And I'm like, I'm so proud that somebody, and I understand that country. And by the way, when their response was to tear everything up in 1989, and kill their leader and drag them through the streets in Romania. Okay? So that's the glasses he looks through. Ceausescu was the president's name in Romania. He's looking from where there is no unity, even within their own country. He said, his last line was, God bless America. But then Tuesday night, there I sit. Sun's been out here, and I'm looking Hands for Hope. And I'm looking at the response of Americans to Harvey and Irma. And all of a sudden, I see no race, no red states, no blue states, no Clemson, no Carolina. Oh, it's hard to be a Carolina fan today. Or last night at halftime when I gave up. I see people responding. Do you know what FEMA says, how they do their job? That 80% of what they do happens because they work with Christians who go and are the hands and the feet. Okay? And all of a sudden, it starts to look like community in a very big context. Because we were made for it. When we go and we understand what we're supposed to do, and we come together and go. So often we think of community as Cornaca or the folks around the lake. There's things that pull us together and right there like that. The lake has its own feel, even for me who lives over in town. But the reality is our Christian faith pulls us together to form a community. We see it when we go to Rice. We see it when we react. We're going to see it whether it's a Wednesday night meal or the beginning of Cru within our church as a bigger group as 3 campuses and 4 services. When we start being pulled together for a common purpose of Christ. We were made for it. It even tells us from the very beginning of creation, we were made for it. When we start thinking about Genesis, there's the sky and the earth and rain and animals, and there's Adam. And God looks and he's alone. And he says, and it's not good. There's no helper for him. The cheetah can't communicate to him. I'm just amazed the cheetah still didn't want to eat him. But God looks at him and he says, Adam needs somebody. So from the very beginning, we were made to be in relationships, in community with others. Sometimes do we act like that? Ooh, even us preachers sometimes get off in like one-man shows. It happens to all of us. Romans chapter 12. So often, and we quote, and I love the very first 2 verses out of this, it talks about how we are changed and transformed as living as a holy sacrifice. We quote 1 and 2 just over and over. And then it talks about, and I could have done this sermon out of verses 3 through 8, and talks about all the different bits and parts, and we do it in here every week. There's people in the sound booth, there's folks who stand out in the halls, there's people who sweep and who put bulletins together. We all have different roles and different pieces, don't we? And that's at Romans 3 through 8. And without those bits and pieces, we aren't who we are called to be as a church. But then he starts to explain how love in action, verses 9 through 13. I'm going to read them to you, and then I'm going to teach. I'm going to walk through this just verse by verse. I think I'm putting on Kay's glasses. Yeah, I got some fancy pattern for my reading glasses today. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never lacking in zeal, but keeping your spiritual favor. Serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. And share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. If we're going to be in community with each other, it says community requires that we have real people, if you're filling in your blanks. When I look at that first verse in 9, it said, love must be sincere. Who we love to talk about, and church planners and church people say, I want an authentic church. I want my people to be real. I like it. But the reality is it scares the fool out of us for the most part. Because that means when I really ask, how are you today? That I'm really asking. It's not the pleasantries that we exchange as we bebop up and down the hall or we see somebody at Walmart. It means that somebody might tell me life stinks or I'm hurting. That was that group of people God had on me at 8 o'clock this morning praying with our other pastors. And it also means that I care about it. By the way, I'm sitting back here and I'm looking at Matt on the back row, and he teaches high school. if he's not real, I have to see how to say this. Those teenagers, their authentic, their real person button or detector will go off in a hurry, won't it? It will. Dean teaching middle school, same way. I think the elementary school might be able to fool them a little longer. Maybe. But you know what? People can tell very quickly if you are sincere, can't they? My wife will tell you, she knows when I'm not listening. Yes, it happens. Y'all have seen it happens. I'm looking for the next person, thinking about something else. But do we come back and really plug in, being real? He says you ought to be sincere. It's amazing to me when it says, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Because the whole out of this church thing that we're doing for 3 weeks, it all starts and hangs on our relationship with Jesus Christ. And we'll get there in a minute to unpack it as a point, okay? But last week, it mattered about our personal identity. If we don't have that, it's going to matter when we get to unity. And we start putting that. And he says, how does that work? He said, hate which is evil. Love and do that which is good. It's amazing it starts to look sincere. To watch somebody go to Rice and do PE. To watch Richard Ball in there loving on kids. It was sincere. To see some of you, some of the stories, it was funny. I was at ERT training or early response team training for our conference yesterday with Renee. And people were talking about, they asked us, how do we seen God? And people were like, the birds in the sky. And I'm like, I see God that way. But tell me where you saw it in a person, please. Because that's authentic and real. Because you are actively waiting on that. Am I going in and out? Okay. Here, if I do this, we won't be able to hear it. All right. We're going to try handheld then. And I won't be able to talk real well that way. Ooh, this ought to be fun. It's probably our batteries are going, but that's okay. He says he wants us to be sincere, to be real. If community is going to happen, we have to be willing to be that as believers. Because they will, just as the teenagers will get mad in the classroom, the folks will get us at Walmart, they'll get us at the food bank tomorrow. They'll be able to tell whether we are real Christians sooner or later. Ooh, and that means we aren't gossiping, we aren't making it all about us. That we're doing the things we do for the right reasons. Ooh, I'm going to preach the other points here in a minute. The second thing that ultimately community requires, it requires that people care. There it says, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Jesus said, right there at the end, it's John 13, verses 34 and 35. One of the last things he does. He says, I give you a new commandment. Love one another. Who we get that part, and then he says, as I loved you. Who remember where he's standing? It's Friday or Thursday night. The shadow of the cross. His idea of community and authenticness and his love is about to be poured out. So you must love one another. He says, and by this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. One of the things that was so amazing in the early church, And one of the reasons I think it grows at such an exponential rate is because people were drawn not just to the cross, but how they loved each other. By the way, it wasn't easy. They were being persecuted, run out of buildings, killed. Remember, Paul is still Saul. He's still chasing them, encouraging Stephen to be stoned. If we look at Acts. Okay? We don't live, it's much different than when I was a child, but we don't live in that environment, do we? He said, you got to care for each other. In the, let's see if I can get my dates right, 250, 270 AD, there's a plague that hits Rome and people are dying by the thousands daily. They would leave the bodies, they wouldn't even bury their own family. The emperor was literally blaming the Christians as the persecution is happening. It didn't make any sense. The Christians are suffering from this same, probably smallpox or measles, untreated. And yet the Christians would stay, they would be the ones who would go out and bury the dead and bury their neighbors. They still cared. You go, well, John, we don't see that. Anybody remember Ebola? Liberia? Doctors Without Borders? The Christian doctors were staying in that town. They were, the one way you could get that disease, one of those was being in that close contact. And yet they stayed. And people are like, everybody else is fleeing. One of the doctors who did that, and actually, he said, we came in and there's a 4-year-old child. The family has left and fled the home that we had to take care of. We had to see that she got buried properly. And the people wanted to know, why are the Christians there? It's because they loved them. They understood community and relationship. They understood the church word a little different than the Connection or St. Mark or whatever. They heard the universal church. They lived it out. It's happening in Houston. It's happening in Florida. It's happened over and over when we go and we start to care for people. Community requires that we're authentic and that we truly care. It also means that people are caring for the right reasons. Community requires that people care for the right reasons. It says, never be lacking, this is verse 11, never be lacking your zeal. Keep up that spiritual desire that it burns inside of you. And then the last part of that is so that you might serve the Lord. What is it that you do how do you do that so that you're serving the Lord? That care starts out of my desire and love for God. That makes it easier for me to care for other people. Here's a scary part of your pastor's personality disc profile. Compassion is one of the lowest things on my scoring. I'm a strong DI. None of you are surprised at that. You're just like, you're a preacher and you score low on compassion. Yes, I do. But the reality is God made me to care for people. That's one of the things that He helped change in me. My personality traits don't lean that way. But what God has done for me, make me so that I can do some of those things. It's how I function in hospice. It's how I get to do pastoral ministry. So sometimes when you get I'm not put your big boy britches on response from me, you'll know I'm responding out of my personality and not out of my love for Christ. And you go, John, you're supposed to do this for the right reasons. Remember that sermon? And then it says we ought to love people the right way. Community requires that we care for people the right way. He says, be joyful, hope, patient. Gosh, patient, Lord? Really? Faithful in prayer. Sharing with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Welcome them in, even when it's inconvenient. Hebrews, forgotten the chapter. Let's hope I put my paperclip in the right place this time, y'all. Hebrews 10, 24 and 25. He said, and let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging another. And all the more as you see the day approaching. He said, even when it's hard, because guess what? They were being persecuted the whole time, scattered. He said, be encouraging. I was working on this and trying to think. Here's how all that ties together, and I'm going to tell you how I want you to try to live it out this week. Community happens, and I think we wrote it down for you on your big idea in your bulletin there. Community happens when followers of Christ journey together, sharing faith and life. When we start walking the road together, Psalms 84, he says, and those who have set themselves on a spiritual journey enter into the valley of Baca, this dark place, so that they may find themselves ultimately, after he's made it a place of springs and pools, water was precious, face to face with God. You and I, as a community of believers, walking along somebody with other folks, can bring them so that they are right there face to face with God, that they may see him. And when we do that, I believe people will be drawn to it. It's one of the reasons I have encouraged us and I pushed so hard and continue on the rice thing. I said, why? I said, go love like we're supposed to love and let God take care of the rest. Because that's what we're supposed to do. Tomorrow at the food bank, go love people we're supposed to love. Let God take care of the rest. That's what happens. The folks, the Doctors Without Borders, the questions came. Katrina, Biloxi, Mississippi, the questions come because we loved unconditionally. It's happening at Harvey. It's happening in Irma. It's happening everywhere we go and do those things. And that's what community looks like as a church. The cool thing is we get to do it together, drawn and pulled together by that, all through Christ. The whole key part of that is followers of Christ can bring community about when we share faith and life together on the journey. Because service is going to end in 5 minutes if I'll stop talking, right? Some of y'all thinking you're still talking? But the journey's still going, isn't it? And so how will we journey together as a community, sharing our love for each other? So here's how, a couple of things you can do this week. Who is it, or ask God to show you somebody that you encounter, you don't know, that random act of kindness. Buy a coffee, buy a Mellow Yellow. Renee's got to buy Dr. Pepper. Do something for somebody you don't know. Buy lunch. In your own church, who's missing? And why? Do you know? Don't call just because you want to see them at church. Call because you care. Okay? Because you love them and you want them to be in community with us. And be an awesome way of sharing our faith and our love. Seek those two things out as part of community and faith. sharing that journey. When we start to do that, people will be drawn to our Jesus. He'll take care of the rest. Let me pray for you this morning, then we're going to have a video where you can put your connection cards in. And for those who this is your church home, you can put your offering in. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for a chance to be in your house. Lord, even this week I've got to see some of my brothers and sisters sharing that love and that grace. Help us all to be prone to doing that and being aware, not getting so caught up in our own stuff. And Lord, fill our cup so we can pour it back out and you can fill it again. Thank you, Father, for your Son. Amen.